Islam has a lot of problems, but I think one of its biggest issues is its relationship to the concept of progressive revelation. For those who aren't aware, progressive revelation is just a term for a phenomenon you're probably already aware of. The idea that the fullness of God's revelation might take the form of successive revelations, with each revelation adding to, clarifying, and perhaps occasionally contradicting and thus abrogating previous revelations. In Christianity, for example, the first revelation was the Torah, and then there were several different prophets before, around, and after the time of the Babylonian exile. Then there was the ministry of Jesus, and then the ministry of Paul, and some other early followers of Jesus who wrote letters clarifying certain Christian doctrines. Now, Islam and several other false religions then build off this idea of successive revelation by imagining that their religious scripture and supposedly prophetic visions are simply advancing this successive revelation further. Obviously, I'm focusing specifically on Islam, but the issue I'll lay out here isn't exclusive to Islam. My concern is that I think Muslims take the concept of a progressive revelation for granted, and as such, unduly view Islam as having some potential legitimacy. The argument would go that you had the Old Testament, and then the New Testament, so surely it's not especially suspect to entertain the idea of a newer testament. But I would argue that this is missing a few key points. See, insofar as Christianity advanced on the theology of biblical Judaism, it didn't take it for granted that this was self-evidently a legitimate course of action. Rather, it is appropriate to apply a retrospective suspicion to Christianity as offering a new revelation, and thus it's appropriate to demand that Christianity justify itself as a new revelation, rather than simply accepting new revelations as if there's some blank check of legitimacy that would in effect justify anybody making any nonsense up and calling it a new revelation. But of course, Christianity does justify its existence as a new or progressed revelation. And I don't just mean in terms of its rapid spread or the account of Jesus rising from the dead giving it legitimacy. I mean simply taking the substance of the revelations found in the Old and New Testament themselves, we find justification for the New Testament. For one thing, the Old Testament is unambiguous in looking towards a future prophet or Messiah, so we know that there must be something more to come. Moreover, many Old Testament passages appear to, at times, present this Messiah as a valiant, warrior-like figure, while other passages present him in a humble and almost subservient role. Jesus Christ, in becoming the sacrificial lamb for humanity and thereby defeating spiritual death itself, fulfills both these depictions. Humble insofar as he was crucified by secular authorities, but warrior-like in that he achieved a great spiritual victory. This is just one example, but the point is that the Old Testament is crying out for some kind of follow-up that addresses a lot of the prophecies and allusions to future events. And the doctrines that are added to the Old Testament aren't added without cause. For example, the idea of the Trinity is not found explicitly in the Old Testament, and as such has been added, but you can find many instances in the Old Testament that strongly imply a multiplicity of divine persons. And as for that which does seem to be a departure from the Old Testament, there is a logic there too. An obvious example would be the dietary laws. In the Old Testament, the purpose of the dietary laws is clearly established as being a way for Israel to distinguish themselves from the people around them, and is concerned with the idea that cleanliness is of the flesh. However, the New Testament commands the faithful followers of God to now spread the good news to all nations. So having strict dietary laws to mark Christians as distinct from other nations would no longer be necessary. Also, Christianity starts to put a bigger focus on the idea that spiritual impureness is more important, with Paul saying in Romans 2 that a circumcision of the heart is what matters, not a circumcision of the flesh. Significantly, this revelation is progressing Christianity into a more universal and intuitively moral system of ethics. I think the vast majority of people would agree with Christ's words in Matthew 15 that it is not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him, but what comes out of it. In other words, being a kind and honest person is more important than following strict dietary laws. So we should ask Christianity to justify itself as a new revelation, and in every sense it does. It answers questions that previous revelations appear to be asking, it fits with and does not contradict previous revelation, and when offering up changes to the faith through revelation, there is a reasonable rationale for this. So Christianity justifies the idea of a progressive revelation, but Islam then takes this justified notion of a progressive revelation and expects that therefore we can just say that the Quran is another progression of revelation and can automatically be taken seriously. But we need to subject Islam to the same suspicions that we should apply to Christianity. If you're claiming to offer up a new revelation, then what is the reason for this that justifies taking this supposed new revelation seriously? Does the Bible leave questions unanswered? Maybe a few, and obviously the Bible looks towards the idea of a final end times with the rise of the Antichrist and the second coming of Christ. However, Islam doesn't even attempt to answer the biggest questions left in the Bible. For example, the Quran also simply anticipates the end times with the Antichrist and the second coming of Christ. The Quran tries to argue that it answers some questions, but it does this by insisting that there is an extra prophet anticipated in the Bible, but that is not evident from the text. On the contrary, many of the passages Muslims point to as passages anticipating this final prophet would explicitly rule out Muhammad. In general, Islam can't function as a progression of biblical revelation because there's nothing that biblical revelation leaves unanswered that Islam offers any sort of answer to. And of course, Islam also contradicts prior revelation, both Old Testament and New. It contradicts the New Testament in innumerable areas since it denies the divinity of Christ, but it also contradicts the Old Testament by disagreeing with the presentation the Old Testament offers of prophets as morally flawed. The issue is if you start contradicting prior revelation, how can you claim to be part of a progression of that revelation? Instead, what Islam is actually offering is a do-over where the Quran is correcting prior scripture. At that point, there must be some pretty good reason for why we should accept that the Quran's retroactive changes to the biblical account should be taken as authoritative, while rejecting the original accounts written much closer to the events they're describing. Finally, when the Quran offers up changes to the Abrahamic faith, there's no obvious logic for this either. The best example would be the dietary laws, where many of the Old Testament dietary laws are abandoned, but for some reason the prohibition of pork is maintained. This isn't a case of some more spiritual notion of righteousness making more carnal religious strictures less relevant. Instead, some carnal religious strictures are maintained, others are abandoned, and new rules are introduced, all without any apparent reason. Certainly, we can't say that this is to make Islam more fit for the role of being a universal religion, since some Islamic laws, like the law about fasting until sunset during Ramadan, would be literally impossible to follow above certain latitudes, where the sun goes weeks without setting. So these changes that Islam offers to the religious rules are hard to view as anything other than entirely arbitrary, and that is the basic issue with Islam's claim to being part of a progressive revelation. It's not the only issue, and there's plenty to elaborate on, but in short, Islam fails at the first hurdle if we rightly decide that the first hurdle for Islam to clear, as a religion that claims to be part of a progressive revelation that follows on from the Judeo-Christian scripture is, okay, so you're claiming to be the final part of a progressive revelation. How do you justify that claim? Every Sunday, all across the world, there are Christians preaching from the Bible, the whole Bible, not just the New Testament, but often the Old Testament. Muslims, on the other hand, preach from the Quran and other Islamic sources. Despite their claim to being part of a progressive revelation, they have no interest in and little knowledge of the scriptures they claim their own scripture advances on. Christians could fill up entire libraries writing about all the ways that Judaism subtly hints towards Christianity, while Muslims desperately scramble for anything that could possibly be seen as a validation of Islam in the Bible, and it's actually surprising just how impossible it is for them to find anything that could convince a neutral observer. This is why I'm not convinced that Islam is true, because I can read the Bible and see how Christianity interplays in such a complex, sophisticated fashion with the text of the Old Testament. There is an obvious and clear reason why the Bible takes the form of a progressive revelation. Understanding that makes everything fall into place and allows us to make sense of the Bible. The Quran, on the other hand, seems to only be interested in the notion of progressive revelation because somebody wanted to make up a load of stuff and then give it the veneer of credibility by latching onto the Christian idea of a progressive revelation without any of the actual justification Christians have for seeing our Bible as progressively revealed.